Theory. Theory and method. Theory and method are totally sort of misunderstood and actually misapplied in academia. Theory, very simply, is the biases or the premises that you have when you're looking at something. In our case, if you want to think about when you're going to interpret something, what are the assumptions that you make? That's your theoretical perspective. Where it becomes tricky is in many cases, people don't really express their theoretical perspective. And I would say in a fair number of cases, people don't even know what their theoretical perspective is. They've got a set of biases or a set of things they assume, but they haven't really sat down and figured out what they are. And that makes that you have to be very careful when you have this, and God knows the internet's full of it, because what that means is if they don't know where they're coming from or they're not forthright about it, you don't know how accurately or how relevant you can take their analysis. This is something the internet's famous for, is garbage in, garbage out. Now, method, on the other hand, is the way that you collect information. So methodology is the forms or the structures that you use when you're trying to collect something. It could be photographic, it could be measured, it could be interviews, it could be all sorts of stuff, not the least of which, of course, is something like YouTube. YouTube is a fascinating and superb place to use as a method because you can watch the same thing a gazillion times, stop it, pause it, rewind it, and you see exactly the same thing. Now, having said that, as you see this in front of you, the downside, of course, is you don't know the context of the photographer or the person posting the video. So you're not sure what else is going on. You're not sure what this particular place in England actually looks like and what people are up to and why are they there? What do the people watching think about it? So when you're using method, method is basically data collection. Method, to a certain extent, also usually includes initial analysis. Theory is the overriding set of biases that you're using when you make an interpretation of what you see. So if you just watch, for example, I'm going to try and see if this actually plays out. If we see a little bit of this Morris dance, method would be the recording of it and the watching of it and basically maybe taking notes or however you want to sort of record what you see. Theory would be trying to make sense of it. What does the dance mean? What do you see going on? What do you think the symbols mean? Obviously, this whole thing is incredibly symbolic, but what do the symbols mean? And of course, that's going to be very difficult because unless you're British, unless you're in fact British from the West Counties, none of this is going to make any sense. Most British have never seen a Morris dance, and I would expect probably half the population wouldn't know a Morris dance if it dropped on their heads, much less what it's about. So this is a unique piece of symbolic performance. And it sort of goes back to this whole idea of theory and method in a very basic way. So let's play just a second of this out. I want you to sort of watch this and assume that you, well, very likely don't know anything about, English cultural social traditions, and especially sort of this identity of what they call West Counties ethnicity, which is very different than other areas. So this is a British thing. It's particularly British, not Scottish, not Welsh. Just this is the Brits. Okay, so that's a little bit of a Morris dance. I don't really know much about these. This particular tradition, in some form, goes back at least 700 or 800 years. What little reading I've ever done on it. Its more popular form only existed for about the last 200 and 250, 300 years, which makes sense because the alphabet's very much like what you'd see in the late 16, early 1700s. And that was a period of time when the British became very concerned about their ethnicity, in contrast to the Scottish and the Welsh. So I have a sneaking suspicion you find that part of this would have to do with sort of building ethnic tradition by taking a traditional performance and sort of either enhancing it or making it more important or doing something to make it more part of the ethnic identity of the population. That's just a guess. It's a major tourist attraction in the West Counties. And I think they have contests. To be honest, I'm not too sure. But this is a good example of something we could then use theory and method on. So we've got the method right here. We've actually got this recording. So what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at this thing from various theoretical positions, if you would, various filters, various biases. And this is the only function of theory. Theory is usually used, especially in academia, whatever your major is. Theory is used as a test to see whether you're actually part of the in group. Do you know the theories in geography? Do you know the theories in anthropology? Do you know the major psych theories? And so it's used as a form of sort of like a union certification. But the reality is the only function of theory is to interpret things. Theory is a tool. And it's important to remember that when you get hung up on this whole idea of someone says, well, my theory is better than yours, or my theoretical approach. There's nothing better or worse theory. There might be more relevant. And we'll see how that plays out when we go through these. But keep the more stance in the back of your mind on this one. Okay, so theory and method we've got. Let's take a look at these over time. Some of this will seem a little bit bizarre, but especially when you're getting to cultural landscapes, and especially to a certain extent, the symbolism of architectural and interior design, then this starts to make a little more sense. The first of the theories that are really sort of relevant, because again, most of these are powerful even still today. One of the interesting things about theories is even when they've come out and the initial proponents and everyone started going like, wow, this is great. Then eventually everyone goes, well, these were a really bad idea. The theories don't disappear. They usually end up sort of shifting over to sort of what you might call the popular world. So theories that used to be powerful in psych or in anthropology or something like that don't disappear. They just become popularized. So you won't find anyone in the discipline talking about them. But if you read something like Psych Today or something like that, they're all over the place. And so it's important to remember that one of the sort of scary things about theory is flaky as they might be, they have an enormous ability to uh, convince people that you know what you're talking about, because they are theoretical approaches. So all of a sudden someone doesn't sound like they're just making it doesn't sound like an opinion. It sounds like somehow this is certified by academic or intellectual research or something like that. So in that context, social evolution. Social evolution is the first of these. Spencer was a buddy slash teacher of Charles Darwin. And they were both interested in this idea of evolution. Think back to our biases. And so they were both convinced that somehow you had evolution as sort of like the engine that drove change. And so Spencer, who was the earlier of the two, he actually was convinced that people were all competing. So he was like the great champion of the idea of unilinear evolution. Now, this is very convenient because we're talking about Britain in the 19th century. So this is the British during the Empire period. And so it's very conveniently basically sort of spun out the logic that the British were actually physiologically, mentally, emotionally, in every way superior to everyone else on the planet. And that's why they should have control of most of the rest of the planet in their colonial empire. So therefore, folks, Aborigines in Australia, folks in India, all of them were folks that had not socially evolved as much as the British had. And so therefore they weren't as good. Having said that, one aspect of social evolution is it was theoretically teachable. So to Spencer, what you could do is you could actually take a group like, say, the British in India, and you could basically take the Indians, strip them what you could of their culture, replace it with British culture. And even though they weren't physiologically part of the same group, they would still be better off than they had been because now they were closer to being true Brits. So social evolution was a hugely powerful engine in the period of imperialism. It's still an enormously powerful engine for folks that are seriously ethnocentric. The idea that my group is right and your group is lame because they're not my group. But since I'm a really nice person, I'll sort of help you guys out. You'll never be as good as me, but you'll be better than if I hadn't helped you out. This is social evolution. It's still a major part of most political discussions, especially as the world's getting very conservative right now. It's a major part of the whole discussion about, why a particular group should theoretically have rights over another group. It's really still based on social evolution. And anthropology pretty much fizzes out by the 1860s, 1870s, because it very quickly becomes clear. One of the major problems with this is who's the better? What do you use as your scorecard? Is it philosophical complexity? Is it your ability to do math and science? Is it your ability to look more religious in the group around you? What are you choosing to rate when you're talking about a group being more than another group? The other part of social evolution is very much tied to the one below it, in the sense that there was a very strong sense that groups somehow were actually organic, in the sense that they were almost like collective entity. In fact, this was a big thing in anthropology for a short period of time, that it was super organic, that cultures were actually sort of like living amoeba organisms that controlled their group. Pretty, 1984, but very popular in that period. It fizzes out pretty quickly again because you can't find any proof for it. There's no way to test for it. And when you do get it, you don't find your predicted results. Second is sociobiology. Sociobiology, again, starts out in the same period. Spencer was big on sociobiology. And it's the idea that basically people inherit their abilities and traits. So basically, not only the way you look, but also the way you talk, how you think. Every aspect of who you are is basically loaded genetically by virtue of your heritage. So your genealogy defines you. So in this case, for example, you have to remember this would include everything, including religion. So in their view, culture was sociobiological. So again, what you had was the idea that some groups were there, and of course, if you tie it to the first one, some groups are inherently better than other groups because they're just superior, they're just better. And then other groups obviously are inferior. You see this a lot, for example, American policies in the 19th, 20th century. This is why you put Native Americans in reservations, because they're inferior. But what you're going to do is you're going to try to teach them to become as close to white folks as you can, but they're never going to be as good. And the original structure between places like Kamehameha schools was the same thing. It was a way to teach Hawaiians to be as close to Anglo-Americans as they could get. But there was already by the late 19th, early 20th century, an attitude that Hawaiians would never be as good as Anglo-Americans because they weren't part of that group. So what you do is you combine concepts what we would now call race, basically genetic heritage and evolution and ability all in one package. Again, there's no evidence to support this. Culture is just the opposite. Culture is learned. So again, in anthropology, this fizzes out pretty quickly. But again, you still hear this a lot today. You see a lot of groups, including a lot of what would be technically minority groups, use sociobiology as a part of group membership. In my background on the reservations, what happens when Native Americans are put on reservations, since the government treats them as wards, you have to figure out who's actually a member of the group. And so what happens is the groups decide based on blood quantum whether you're going to be a member of that particular tribe or group or not. Now, Native Americans had no idea of blood quantum. People were adopted and people moved around all over the place, just like in Polynesia. But under the Western concept, which was based in sociobiology, now you used blood quantum as a measure of culture. And the Hawaiian homes is a good example in the Hawaiian context. It's not part of Hawaiian traditional heritage, but it certainly is part of the American structured system that comes in with territorial status. You use sociobiology as a measure, and sad to say, you find sociobiology is still used by a ton of different groups to define membership. But what you're usually talking about is this value membership, ethnic membership, cultural membership. One of the things they'll ask is, well, what blood are you? So sociobiology disappears in the academic disciplines real quickly, but it's still a huge part of the world in the 21st century. Having said that, this isn't unique to the Western context either. In Asian systems, sociobiology is pretty much everything. So if you're in China, Korea, Japan, you find that there's a very strong attitude, both socially, but also actually in many cases legally, that individuals are basically defined by their genetic heritage. So whether they're talented, whether they're going to be trouble, whether they're going to be smart, all of this stuff is somehow completely defined by the heritage, by their genealogy, by their genetics, if you would. Now, of course, the ultimate nightmare of this is in the early 20th century with the National Socialist Party in Germany, and the idea that you actually breed superior people, the idea of the Aryan race concept, which actually starts in Sweden, terrifyingly enough. But then, very much then there's two parts of that. One is if you breed folks who are superior, you're going to end up with folks who are even more superior. Also, what you should do then, of course, is cull or get rid of the folks that are inferior so that you don't have to deal with them. So the whole genocide that the Nazis practiced in the 1930s and 40s is based on what they would call science of sociobiology. And so, again, the problem is if when you think about, you're talking about Aryan race, but what the hell is Aryan? Who defines? Why would someone's intelligence be based on whether they have blonde hair or blue eyes? So sociobiology is, again, one of those areas that originally was an intellectual sort of exercise for academics, especially anthropologists and psychologists, but very quickly leaves their discipline, leaves their domain, and becomes part and parcel of pretty much every racist, extremist group that wants to define the fact that they're superior, and still is, just as popular in the 2020s as it was, in 1920 or in 1860. So it's a rather terrifying example of how academic disciplines have a huge impact outside of their, sort of initial intent or goal, if you want to think of it that way. Now, both of these get replaced very quickly by an equally tidy one, which also was, of course, hugely tied to colonialism. And this is the idea of environmental determinism. This is still really popular in Europe. It's not as popular in the United States for the simple reason that you have to remember, with the exception of a very small part of the population, which is Native American, everyone else in North America is a migrant. So it's real hard to argue environmental determinism to the same extent here. But in Europe, you'll still see this as a basic assumption a lot of people have, most governments have it. It's a very strong sense that basically a particular place and the environment in that place shapes the behavior and culture of the people. So the idea that the British are different than the French because the Brits live on an island and the French live in the western part of the European continent, that's the idea of environmental determinism. In a modern context, the American stereotype of folks from the Middle East, say Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Dubai, and stuff like that, would be based on environmental determinism. Oh, they live in deserts, they have camels, all these sort of goofy stereotypes. But that also then is used as a way to define, judge, and basically critique their cultures. So environmental determinism had the advantage, unlike the earlier forms, that you could measure it. You could actually talk about climate, rainfall, sun days, whatever it is you wanted to use. So you can actually measure the environment. Where it became really goofy was the idea that you could somehow take that environment that would actually shape behavior collectively and individually, especially collectively. To a certain extent, there is some logic in it. If you want to have suntans, you probably don't want to go to Iceland, for example, or for example, Seattle. So to a certain extent, there's some things you can't do very well because of functional restrictions by virtue of environmental conditions. Having said that, there's basically no evidence that environment has a huge impact on culture or group or even individual behavior. So again, this is the third. So if we go back to our Mora stance we looked at a little while ago, then if you looked at this from a social evolutionary point of view, the Mora stance would be part of the British past. The fact that only the Brits did it would mean that it helped to basically make the British better and superior and different than everyone else. From a sociobiological point of view, you could argue, well, the only people who could dance the Morris dance would be folks who are actually British genetically, because no one else could do the dance. They might be able to learn the steps, but they wouldn't be able to understand the social ritual motivations behind them because they're not real Brits. And that would be a classic sociobiological approach. An environmental determinist approach would be in somehow, way, shape, or form the fact that Britain is the way it is climatically and environmentally leads people to dance like that. I'm not sure how you want to stretch that. Maybe the flowers in the hat or something, but that would be sort of the third of those. So those are the first three of these theoretical approaches. And notice how they're used to explain stuff. I mean, they're used to explain, this is what I think is going on when I see this. And that's theory.